So I'm out here, my force into the ground is less, and it gets more and more and more and more and more and more and more. Then it's max, and then it's less, and then it's less, and then it's less, and then it's less, and it's less, right? Good morning. Happy Wednesday. I have Neuro Coffee in hand, and it is perfect. Okay. So today's Wednesday. That means that tomorrow is Thursday, which means 6 a.m. tomorrow morning Eastern Standard Time. We will have the usual Coffee and Coaches conference call. So please join us for that. We've had great groups of people, great questions. I think everybody enjoys these calls. They keep coming back. So I appreciate you all, and I will see you all at 6 a.m. tomorrow morning. Okay, digging into today's Q&A. It's with Andrew. So Andrew's questions pertained to compressive strategies and breath holding. And the one thing we want to try to recognize here is that it's not always a bad thing. They are representative of certain elements. So sometimes during performance where we need to limit movement options, under those circumstances, we are going to hold our breath. We can also use it diagnostically in the gym when we're working with clients, is we're going to see compensatory strategies that are associated with limiting ranges of motion or limiting movement options and breath holding. So we sort of hashed that out a little bit. And then we got into a little bit about the influence of how important experience is as you evolve your coach's eye, so to speak, in the gym, and how we accomplish that, which cannot be acquired through consuming explicit information. So I hope you enjoyed this call. Everybody have a terrific Wednesday. I will see you tomorrow morning at 6 a.m. Oh, don't forget, if you would like to participate in a 15-minute consultation, please send an email to askbillhartman@gmail.com, askbillhartman@gmail.com, and we will get that set up at our mutual convenience. Okay, have a great Wednesday. I'll see you tomorrow morning at 6 a.m. We are going to record. We are recording, and the timer has started. Andrew, fire away.
So according to your model, expansion and compression are the two general strategies that we can use to navigate through space.
Correct.
And as such, obviously, a compressive strategy is something that could be good or bad depending on the context. Because if we have a global compressive strategy and we're trying to overcome something, limit motion, then that's a good thing. And so obviously there's this element of context dependence when it comes to whether a compressive strategy is a good or a bad thing. Right. And it seems to me that there's kind of this gray area of when does a normal compressive element to an exercise or to an activity turn into a compensatory strategy or something that's limiting motion and not allowing us to get the most out of a movement, whatever it happens to be.
Right.
And I've heard you describe this as like lack of relative motion or lack of breathing excursion.
Yep.
So one way that I've identified when somebody is in compensation land is they just can't breathe. Okay. And I'm wondering, I want to hear from the source, is there like a moment, is there like a defined transition point where we go from being in some sort of normal mechanical zone to compensatory zone? And if so, how do we identify that moment as coaches and therapists? Because obviously we don't want to just say compression equals bad and expansion equals good, because they're both necessary. Right. So I want to hear from you. Is there a moment? Is there a defined something when that happens? And if so, how do we identify it with our eyes or our measures?
Yep. Okay. So to really, really simplify this, you're absolutely correct that at the moment where someone has to hold their breath, you have somebody that is trying to reduce the degrees of freedom of movement. Okay, so degrees of freedom would be all of the options available. So let's say you have 244 degrees of freedom.
Okay.
There's more than that, but we won't talk about those. But let's just say there's 244. Okay. So I have 244 possible movement segments that are available to me to use for movement. However, the higher the force production that I need to utilize, the more I want to restrict those. Stands to reason. Because if I have this total freedom of movement, all I'm going to do is I'm going to dampen the forces throughout the system, which is useful. But again, if I'm trying to produce force, I'm trying to be fast or whatever, I need to move segments together so I don't dissipate the force, so I can actually store and release that energy in the system, right? Rather than dampening it. Okay. So if I squeeze myself really, really tight to limit segmental movement, stands to reason I have to hold my breath to do that, don't I? Because I can't really breathe in if I'm squeezing. That's higher internal pressures, which would make me exhale.
Mm-hmm.
However, I close off the airflow, right? And then I hold my breath and I squeeze against that. Now I'm a very, very stable structure, and now I can produce very, very high forces. The thing that you have to understand is that those forces are relative to the individual. So if I have a 40-year-old accountant that has never played a sport in their life, and I'm asking them to perform something physical, what they may find is that they have to hold their breath just to sit down onto a box. Whereas I have a very high-level athlete that is highly trained, they've demonstrated high levels of force production in the gym, their strategy may be a whole lot easier to sit down onto that same box because the relative force applied is much, much lower for them than it is for our 40-year-old accountant that's never played a sport before. So all of those things are relative, but you're absolutely right. Like one of the easiest ways to tell when somebody is trying to limit motion is that they'll hold their breath. And then one of the other cool things that you have to recognize is that it's typically going to occur at a similar time, regardless of the individual. So at the peak element of force production is typically where you're going to have to limit segmental motion. So this would be at maximum propulsion. So if I'm just walking across the ground, there is a moment in time where the foot that's on the ground is applying its maximum force for that circumstance, for that context. So it's not the maximum force that they can apply. It just has to be the maximum force in that circumstance, right? And so that is a compressive strategy. And so I move towards that. So if I'm at the two ends of gait, right? So I'm stepping forward over this foot and I'm about ready to leave this foot. So that's the extreme. As I move my center of gravity over the one and they get closer and closer to being in the middle, right? That middle propulsive strategy, which is internal rotation, which is high force into the ground. So I'm out here, my force into the ground is less and it gets more and more and more and more and more and more and more. Then it's max and then it's less and then it's less and then it's less and then it's less and it's less, right? So at this point, at the transition where I'm applying the greatest force into the ground, that's where I'm going to restrict the greatest amount of relative motion. That's where I'm most likely to reduce my ability to breathe under those circumstances, right? And it's going to be context dependent. But that's basically how it works. Every movement that you perform has that built in. Because at some point in time, assuming I'm influencing the ground, right? And the ground is influencing me. So I have my equal and opposite forces, right? Under those circumstances, I'm always going to have a point of maximum propulsion. And this includes, like, if I'm just rolling across the ground, there's a point where I'm putting maximum force into the ground. If I'm walking across the ground, there's a point where I'm putting the maximum force for that context on the ground. If I'm doing a split squat, it's the same thing. If I'm doing a squat, it's the same thing. If I'm jumping off the ground, it's the same thing. If I'm landing on the ground, it's the same thing. There has to be a point where I'm applying that force, right? The question mark is, am I capable of releasing that strategy when I need to, or am I carrying it around all the time? Because the relative load for me, as an individual, is always very, very high. So these are the people that are walking around with compressive strategies that become interference. And under many of those circumstances, these are the people that experience discomfort because they're not changeable enough. Okay. So let me give you another extreme. We can always use powerlifters because they are representative of the greatest force producers of all time, right? Like they lift the heaviest things that anybody's, well, strongman, powerlifter, kind of in the same vein. To create that degree of adaptation, to allow them to produce those forces, they have to be able to maintain those all the time, right? So their adaptations become so strong that they give up resources. They have to shift all of their resources in one direction, right? And again, we would see this under any circumstance where somebody has taken something to the nth degree, where they are super specialized under certain circumstances. And we're talking about physical, but this could be applied to cognitive as well, right? And so their adaptability becomes limited, but because their adaptability is limited, they demonstrate superpowers because of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so again, we just have to appreciate that when we're talking about like general population clients who we want to make sure that we're influencing health in a favorable way. We want to make sure that they're able to apply the compressive strategies when we want them to, and then able to reduce them when we want them to. Right?
Definitely. Absolutely.
Does that clarify that to a sufficient degree for you?
Yes.
Okay.
And I suppose if you're looking at a general population client and you're assessing whether or not there is some sort of compressive strategy at, I don't know, let's just say the posterior hip or something like that.
Okay.
Is it necessary to just look at the movements and have a degree of experience with seeing these things? Because I noticed that developing in my own training.
Yep.
To identify that's there, or is there something, are there things that are just visual, that it's like something, let me say that in a different way. Are there things that are definitions where it's like, if this segment does this, or if this toe does this,
Correct.
like that,
Yes.
does that exist? Or
Absolutely.
Is it just simply the trained eye?
Absolutely. Now, so let's be fair. There are things that you won't be able to see. Like I've never seen a moving living spine. Okay. All right. I have a general representation of where things might be, but I've never actually seen a living moving spine. Like my X-ray vision is not very good. All right. So we're using approximations of what we see as the representation. What we want to understand with the use of compression versus expansion is that what those strategies provide us are movement in certain areas. So the split squat's always a really good one as a representation, because you have to move from a sort of a step forward, step back kind of thing. So we're kind of looking at what would happen during a step, like if you're walking.
Right.
So at the top of the split squat, you're biased towards ER. At the bottom, you're biased towards IR. And so we kind of know that. And so anything that would be a deviation away from those representations. So if we were to look at a knee position as a representation in a split squat. So at the top, I know I'm kind of biased towards my ER strategy. So the lead foot would be biased a little bit more towards, probably because the foot's on the ground, it's going to be an early representation of ER. As I descend, I should see internal rotation, okay? But if I see the hip turn the knee outward in a split squat, and I see that deviation, then I know that they're searching for a new space, right? Because they didn't have enough external rotation as they started to descend, so that I didn't have any space to superimpose the IR on, so they move the knee outward. That creates an external rotation space, and then they can still apply force into the ground. Because their foot's on the ground, they have to be applying force into the ground. There's like no ands, ifs, or buts, right? Because again, we are grounded, okay? But I'm still trying to find that ER space. So what that tells me is that, again, I don't have enough external rotation under those circumstances. Therefore, there's not enough space for them to perform the activity as I would, in most cases, prescribe it.
Right. So
Okay,
the split
so
squat.
that is a visual representation. That's a very easy one to see. Okay, now the more times you see something, so this is where experience comes into play. So let's just say you've seen 100 split squats performed, and so your brain now takes a snapshot of a split squat, and then you have a representation in your head based on those 100 split squats of what is within the safe and adequate range for you, right? That is your model of a split squat. And you say anything that falls within this is going to be okay. Anything outside of this is probably something I need to do. Now, let's say that you've seen 10,000 split squats. You have a much more clear picture of that representation. So at 100, it's kind of pixelated. It's a little grainy, it's not very clear. And then at 10,000, you've refined it, right? And so now when you take that snapshot, instead of looking at different segments or different pieces, you see this one representation, and you can start to see everything in its relative position to other elements of the split squat. And so now it becomes much more refined.
Right. And then you can relate that to how other movements look. And so the really easy representation of the split squat then can be built up on top of with your other representations of movements.
Right. So exactly. So you look at the split squat and you go, oh, I see this, or I see this limitation. And then you say, okay, if that limitation exists, I should see it show up in another activity. So pick whatever activity you want. You say, I should see it show up in that. What a great confirmation.
Right.
Very useful, very useful. And now as the coach, you go, either I want to see that, or I don't want to see that. If I don't want to see that, then I know that I've just changed my exercise selection, because I don't want to reinforce the negative. I want to enhance their capability. So that helps me with my exercise selection overall, because I know that this is going to be an influence in any number of different activities. So if I see a hip limitation in a split squat, I should expect to see a similar limitation in a squat, or I would see a similar limitation in an overhead press, or I'd see a similar limitation in a step up, or if they're doing bounce or jumps or medicine ball, it doesn't matter what we're talking about. Now I understand how this is going to create a potential either enhancement if it's force production, or potentially a reduction in relative motion where I may want it.
Right. And, I remember over the Christmas break, I joined a call, and you called me out for saying the N-word. And ever since then,
clarify that.
Right. For
neutral spine.
Saying the neutral spine. Yeah.
Neutral spine.
I use that when describing a back squat, and how you can see that moments when it slips into extension away from neutral. And so ever since then, I've been just trying to develop a more nuanced perspective of what constitutes normal mechanics. So the confirmation that it's simply representations that we use to confirm our suspicions is good. It's also a little terrifying if you're a new coach or therapist to just be like, we don't really know what's going on. I mean, I've been doing this for almost 6 years, but a lot of people, are just starting.
Yep.
And I guess one of the elements of my journey is going to be figuring out how to communicate this better and better to people.
Right. But that's where the apprenticeship model becomes so important, and especially for what we do, because there is so much that is experiential. So when you're in the gym, like everything that we've talked about in this call is about the influence of how experience helps us just determine what the interventions are, identify what we're looking at, and what the best choices may be based on the probabilities that we have. And that those probabilities come with experience. If I just got my 30-day certification that somehow qualifies me to actually work with people, right? And I don't have any of those representations. Where do you get them? Well, you get them from people that have more experience, because what they're going to be able to do is they're going to be able to share their experience with you through reality, like literally working with people, right? That's why we do the internships at IFAST. It becomes so important because people need the actual experience of doing these things versus just sitting in the purple room and drawing on the whiteboard and saying, this is how it is, right? We can have that. It's useful information. But until you go out and you actually do it and you try to influence those changes and you try to identify what you're looking at, you're a bit lost. And so again, how you communicate it is going to be through that experience where you're going to see things that somebody that's never worked with anybody before can't see, right? And then you're going to have to do this through a representation. But that's why it's so important, because you can't explain these things. You, like verbally, you can't do it. There's different types of information. So the explicit information is the stuff that people read and watch on the internet through videos or somebody expressing something. And then there's the tacit. And so that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the tacit element. There's only one way to acquire that, and that is through experience. You can't explain it to anybody.
Absolutely.
Right? Yeah. And that's why this is hard, right? And this is also why there are all these ridiculous arguments that show, well, it's true, is because you could have two people arguing back and forth on any social media platform or wherever they may be. They both may be correct based on the moment in time that they are talking about it, yet they appear to have this conflict going back and forth, when the reality is, it's like, oh yeah, because what you saw was not the same thing that this person saw, because you both there. You both weren't there at the same time. You're both in different contexts. They can both be correct.
Right. Well, the whole experience of watching your YouTube videos and struggling to apply it with my clients over the past year has been illuminating in terms of what learning actually is. Because it's not just reading things. Like there's no, especially for this, there's no way that you could possibly learn everything just by reading something. And I guess that's the kind of the cookbook analogy. It's like there is no cookbook because you have to take that and then make something. So
that is correct. That is
yeah.
correct.
Yeah. Okay. That's helpful. That's helpful to know that there aren't really obvious, that there aren't concrete things that I can say, this is compensatory and this isn't, but we can use kind of proxy measures like the breathing and
absolutely.
Okay.
Position, breathing, shape, right? When we talk about the shape, right? Because we can actually identify those things. But again, it's an understanding. It's having an understanding of what those representations may be. Also, humble yourself a little bit and recognize the fact that you'll probably be wrong sometimes. And that's just reality. Just don't hurt people, right?
Right.
It's always a safe experiment. You're not putting people at risk under those circumstances. If you're unsure, you don't do it.
Right.
Right.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yep.
All right.
Great.
Good to talk to you, young man. I will probably see you next week, right?
Absolutely. I'll be active on the Facebook group.
There you go. All right. Have a great day.
Take care. Have a great day.